What do you call an alligator in a vest? An alligator in a vest. An investigator. Well done. I love it. What did the mom chameleon say to her nervous kid on the first day of school? What's that? Just blend in? That's pretty good. I like that. Don't worry, you'll blend right in. You guys are good. You guys are good. Okay, pretend you're in a jungle and a tiger's chasing you. What do? Stop pretending. You guys catch that? All right. This Friday, quiz 5 is due by 11:59 p.m. And Monday, what's significant about Monday? I'm not here, thanks. It's actually President's Day, which is the most significant, but I appreciate that you remember that I'm not going to be around. That's the second most important thing. Third most important thing is you're going to be watching an online lecture. And I looked at it, and so whatever it was in the spring of last year, it was the same. Oh, it was probably the same date. It was probably President's Weekend. So I also missed it in the fall, but it wasn't President's Weekend. So there's some conflict. So it's actually a lecture where I'm walking through the slides and I'm in my office. It's not in the lecture hall, okay, for Monday. So it's kind of a little bit more traditional online lecture, okay? And then next Wednesday, we'll be back in here. Do you guys see the forecast for Friday? Looking pretty good, shaping up. I thought there were some models that showed it coming as early as tonight, but then it all pushed into Friday. Thursday night, tomorrow night, and then to Friday. So kind of probably our one and only. I don't know. We'll see if we get more snow, but hopefully we do. But it should be significant. It should be like 7-ish inches in town, 7 inches, half a foot. Oh, I have no idea. Yeah, I don't know. How long is it going to last? I'm not a weatherman. I just like to watch the weather patterns because I enjoy the snow. And I'll be out of town this weekend, so I'm like, doesn't really impact me, right? That's the way I work. Yeah. But it should be a great weekend. Might be a little crowded on the mountain, but it should be really nice. Probably the best conditions we've had all season. Okay, so what is this picture up in the upper left? What do we have here? You can't appreciate the marrow, but the marrow would occupy the open spaces. Okay, you don't see it there because it's actually been demarrowized. What kind of tissue is that? If that's marrow would occupy the space. Spongy bone. Yeah, spongy bone. Nice. Trabeculated bone. You remember that? So we're going to talk about the skeletal system for the next 3 lectures. And exam 2 is going to be on skin and bones, or the integument and the skeletal system. So we're about kind of halfway through after today. We're about halfway through the material for exam 2. You're like, wow, I feel like we just did exam 1. So when you have 5 exams in the semester, you have less time between exams. It's just like math. Okay, but here's the good news, is you have less material on each exam, and you have more points out of the total number of exams to actually go do well, and we drop your lowest exam score. Remember that? Let me repeat how the exams work for those of you that are still trying to kind of navigate that from exam 1. We're going to have a bonus opportunity for exam 2. And you have to be in class to get the passcode. And so even if you're watching online, I strategically edit or clip, or I walk to the iPad and I hit stop, and then I show the code. All right, it's my incentive for you guys to come to class. Same thing with participation points. Participation points are not bonus. They're actually counted. They're in your syllabus. There's 50 total participation points, 10 per unit. So we'll have 10 available for this unit, unit 2. One of them will be handed out in class. The other one will be handed out in any of the review sessions. Yes, we'll give you participation points for going to a study review session. You can even attend one on Zoom for the review sessions if you're working or you can't make it in person, okay? But the bonus are truly bonus. So what will happen again for exam 2 is we'll have exam 1 or exam 2 scores, like your raw score, and then we'll have bonus 2 assignment, the column right next to it, and then we'll have exam 2 total, which is the combo or the addition of those two columns. And for a couple of hours on the evening of exam 2, when we're grading and entering grades, your Canvas score is going to be all over the place. Okay? And then the next morning or the next afternoon, I'll send out a message saying your exam 2 total scores are now posted. Because your exam 2 total score is exam 2 raw plus your bonus 2 opportunity, which is purely bonus. Does that make sense? Someone asked in office hours, is it always out of 8 points? No, it's not always. It's going to fluctuate. You know, we've been doing this a while, so we kind of know about what we need from a bonus opportunity to get that average where it should be. And that's essentially how I make sure that the class is, you know, curved appropriately. We kind of do it along the way. So it's not this mystery at the end of the semester of like, hey, I've got like a 77% and I have no idea what I'm getting in the class. Like, it's just a straight scale. And so you'll see your grade calculate and total accurately throughout the semester. Does that all make sense? Okay. So back to skeletal system, bones, cartilage, and ligaments. Now, we've talked about all three of these because we talked about them in what unit? In unit 1, in tissues. And we're tracking pretty nice with lab because you're starting to talk about the skeletal system. There's a lot of bones in lab for you to review. So you're going to be in the bony architecture for a while, and we will move on. So that's where lab and lecture will start to kind of deviate from each other, because we'll spend 3 lectures a week and a half in skeleton or skeletal system or bones, and then we move on. We have an exam, we move to the next unit. But bones, cartilage, and ligaments were all part of that connective tissue section that we went through, and they form this framework for which the body leans on. The cartilage, interestingly enough, forms an embryonic framework, meaning in development, for future bone ossification. And we're going to talk about 2 ways that bones formed at the end of today. 2 different ways that you form bone. So, you know, like we traditionally do, we're going to talk about all of the functionality of bones. This is the purpose. This is what they do for you and for me. They provide support and protection as well as facilitate movement. The musculature, the muscle system, is going to pull and contract on bones using tendons and ligaments as their attachment points in some cases. And the bony framework is what actually is making the motion. And the skeletal muscle is what's making the contraction, and it's pulling one appendage closer to another or pulling one appendage further away from another. But the last 3 that are a little bit less intuitive, electrolyte balance, acid-base balance, and blood formation, are equally as important. So electrolyte balance, what are electrolytes? What are some examples of electrolytes? Salt. What else? Potassium. You've seen a trend? Ions. Calcium would be an electrolyte. That happens to be the one that the skeletal system really focuses heavily on, is calcium homeostasis or calcium balance. So the skeleton stores calcium, copious amounts of calcium in the bones. Remember in the skin, we talked about the conversion with UV light of cholesterol to vitamin D. You remember that? And then vitamin D has activity on the gut and the kidney to manage calcium. You prevent it from being excreted in the kidneys, and you encourage it being resorbed or taken up in the body in the gut out of your diet. And that calcium is then deposited in the bone for a period of time until it's needed, and then it's liberated, it's put in the bloodstream as an electrolyte to have a physiologic function. It has a very important physiologic function in muscle contraction, and we'll hear about that later in the semester. I'll flash back to here. I'm foreshadowing to later, but all of these systems, remember, all these systems are like intimately intertwined. We just have nice little categories for them and labels because it's easier for us. But the skeletal system and the muscle system, or the musculoskeletal system, as the two of them put together, are in close concert with each other. They work together. So electrolyte balance, the main electrolyte here is calcium homeostasis. Acid-base balance. So the bone tissue helps to buffer the blood against excessive pH swings, excessive acidity or excessive basic high pH or basic levels. It can do this by either absorbing or releasing alkaline phosphate and carbonate salts. So these are buffer systems that actually either buffer the acid form or buffer the base form and kind of keep a homeostatic norm. Then the last one, which we kind of alluded to on the first picture, the first scanning electron micrograph of the spongy bone or trabeculated bone, is blood formation. So in the marrow space, that's what we're going to talk about a little bit later today. The marrow tissue is where blood cells are actually made. So you make red blood cells as well as white blood cells in the bone marrow. So 6 different functions for bone. It's just not protection, right? It's just not a hard skeleton like many of us have thought for most of our life. Now, in lab and in lecture, we categorize these, right? We've got long, short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid. And you can see some examples like you saw in lab and in the lab manual. But some of these definitions, I mean, the long bones, they're longer than they are wide. Some examples of long bones, well, that was weird. Some examples of long bones are like the arms and the legs. Short bones, these are equal and typically they're equal in length and width. I'm not sure why it's doing that. Oh, that's weird. Oh, you know why? It's because my screen's touching the screen. Oh, this is a touch screen. That's weird. Okay. I had one. It's screens touching each other. Stay. So short bones. Short bones are typically equal in length and width. You'll see short bones in the hands and the feet. Flat bones, like the sternum, or flat bones of the skull. And they truly are just really flat. And we'll look at some developmental ways that bones are made. It will highlight the bones of the skull here in a little while. Irregular bones, they're very unusual in shape, so don't fit into a nice category. And then sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones are bones that develop between ligaments or between muscles. And they're usually kind of free-floating, a sesamoid bone. An example is the kneecap, or what we refer to as the patella. Now, we can also categorize these by location, and you're doing this in lab as well. You're going to talk about the axial skeleton and then the appendicular skeleton. And the axial skeleton is everything that's shaded in white. The axial skeleton is the long axis of the body, the skull, the vertebral column, as well as the rib cage. Everything in white on this figure. In contrast, everything in green is the appendicular skeleton. So that includes the shoulder girdle, the pelvic girdle, or the hips, and the upper lower arm and hand, the upper lower leg and feet. Appendicular skeleton. So again, just nomenclature to help us to kind of describe where bones are found. Talk about their shape, we talk about where their location is, and then you can nicely categorize or describe what's going on, clinically. Now, types of bone. So we already kind of introduced these two categories of compact bone and spongy bone. If you remember compact bone, we also refer to it as cortical or osseous bone. It's heavy, it's dense. It makes up 1/4 of all bone. Compact bone has this sort of characteristic of it where it's called this diploe. This diploe is a Greek term that means two-sided. And so compact bone has sort of two different characteristics to it. We've got, a hard surface, and then we have an in-between surface, and then we have another hard surface. So, for example, if you take like the skull, you took a cross-section of one of the bones of the skull, it's very much like a helmet. So there's like a hard outer covering, there's like a spongy in-between phase, and then there's a hard bottom layer. And it kind of looks like an Oreo cookie, right? So it's got like hard crust on either side and then something soft in the middle. So that's this characteristic of bone, is you usually find bone in this diploid fashion, where it's like multiple types of bone within a bony structure. Now, compact bone, dense, heavy, not a lot of open space to it. And then spongy bone. Spongy bone, also referred to as cancellous or trabeculated bone, has the open architecture, like that first picture that we saw, that scanning electron micrograph on the opening title slide. It has that open space. It has a medullary cavity. It has open areas for bone marrow to actually be populated. The spongy bone on this picture, so this is actually the upper arm that's inserting into the armpit, or the scapula, to be more accurate. So you have the humerus into the scapula, and you form a synovial joint. Well, in that space, you can kind of appreciate there's this gap that's actually filled with fluid, synovial fluid, and we'll get there later in the semester, and you'll get there in lab. So that actually prevents the bone-on-bone rubbing. It's kind of a oil, if you will. Synovial fluid, if you've ever felt it, it feels like oil. Like if you put it between your fingers, it feels like putting a drop of motor oil or mineral oil between your fingers. That actually is what's in your joints. It's super slippery. Here you can't really appreciate that, but you can kind of see the close proximity of the proximal portion of the humerus inserting into the distal portion of the scapula. And on the very tip of that proximal portion of the humerus, we actually see compact bone. And on the very end, or the distal end of the scapula, you can also see compact bone. So look at the very bottom image. You can appreciate compact bone, compact bone. And then just in proximity to it is this open spongy bone right here. Right? So this concept of compact bone, spongy bone, compact bone, that's that diploid that I'm talking about. That's that sandwiching effect that we see in lots of places in the body. So we utilize the different architectures of bone, and we're going to talk about why. Why would we do that? Well, mechanically, you have a hard surface here interacting with a hard surface here. You want something very dense and very hard, because over time, your synovial fluid is going to wear out. Now you replenish it, but we do have in older patients, very active older patients, we get osteoarthritis, where you have bone-on-bone interaction and you get a lot of inflammation because of the grinding. Mom, dad, aunts, uncles, grandparents have probably complained about that. Okay. Then down here, you can keep the bone a little bit lighter by keeping it open in a spongy architecture, and then we can pack it full of marrow that actually helps manufacture blood cells, which is kind of cool. All right, some other features of bone as we continue on. So we look here at the diaphysis, the epiphysis. So diaphysis is the long shaft portion, and the epiphyseal ends, there's a proximal as well as a distal epiphyseal end. And in between the two, there's actually a growth plate in our long bones. We actually have growth plates known as the epiphyseal line. And we're going to talk more about that in the next lecture on these growth plates. We'll talk about it a little bit at the end today, and then we'll finish up with it next lecture on Monday. But these epiphyseal ends and these growth plates, the long bones is where most of your growth as an adult happens. as you extend your long bones. So your long bones will continue to elongate. That gives you more of the height in the arms and the legs. And of course, there's some defects that are associated with that. All right, there's dwarfism as an example, and we'll talk about that as one particular clinical example. But so the shaft is the diaphysis, the epiphysis. There's two epiphyses, proximal and distal, and then we have the periosteum. This periosteum is this outer fibrous collagen layer that covers the bone. This periosteum, if you kind of peel it back, it's highly vascularized. If you look in lab and you're able to handle real bones, we do have real bones in the lab. Now, usually they're put away and they're in a bin in the back because we have students that for cultural or religious reasons cannot touch human remains. And so we don't put out any of the human bones. They're all plastic. It's usually our MO. But if you want, you can ask to see an actual authentic real bone, human remain bone. And if you look down the middle of the diaphysis and you kind of actually, this hole that comes out, this nutrient foramen, is where the main blood vessel goes into the bone to vascularize the entire bone. Now, it's not a hole that you can see if you're holding the bone, like this. You won't be able to see it coming at a right angle. You'll probably have to look at it because it dives this direction, or you'll have to look at it that way because it dives that direction. So it's going to come in an oblique angle. On this picture, it looks like it's just like right angle, just a right turn into the bone. In reality, it's more of an oblique angle, but you can actually see it, and it's pretty large. You can see it with the naked eye. That's how big of a blood vessel actually enters into the bone. Because this vascularization is key, especially if we have marrow spaces that are making blood cells. You actually have to have a blood supply to get the blood cells into circulation, right? But this extensive vascularization is why bones heal so well. And the extensive vascularization of skin is why skin heals so well. And then we said earlier in the tissue lecture that the poor vascularization of ligaments and tendons is why they don't heal well at all. All right, then we have this inner osteogenic layer. This inner osteogenic layer that we're going to talk about, where we get a lot of osteoblastic activity. We have our regenerative layer of bone, and we have a turnover of our cell types that we're going to talk about more as we dive into today. So just to finish up with the epiphyseal lines, so those during development in utero are cartilaginous. These are cartilaginous. And as you grow in childhood and into adulthood, and usually these epiphyseal lines will close about the age of 16 in females and about the age of 18 in males, and it's plus or minus a year. So usually by 16, females have reached their terminal height, and by 18, men have reached their terminal height. And what's replaced by the cartilage is bone cells. And then it ossifies and it forms a line. And it forms what we call this epiphyseal line. From the epiphyseal plate, we get an epiphyseal line. So you can actually determine in a child approximate height by imaging the epiphyseal plate and determining if it's still open or if it's closed. Okay, now some other features as we move on. In the endosteum, which is the inner lining of the bone, we find reticular connective tissue dominated by osteoblasts as well as osteoclasts. Now, who can remind me the difference between osteoclasts and osteoblasts? Which does which? Yeah, osteoblast builds and osteoclast breaks it down, right? So we osteoblastic, bone building, the alliteration of blast, building the bone, and then the osteoclasts are the ones that break it down. That's right. So this epiphyseal line is the point of growth, and it moves in the distal direction in this way, and it moves in the proximal direction up top. So you elongate the bone in both directions as you grow. And then we talked about this epiphyseal line as it ossifies, about 16 for females and 18 for males. Okay, so let's talk about these osteoblasts and these osteoclasts in a little bit more detail. So remembering that bone is a connective tissue, tell me the relative proportion of the matrix to the cells in connective tissue. It's matrix rich and it's cell poor. It doesn't mean that there aren't any cells. It just means in comparison to epithelium, you have more extracellular matrix per unit area than you do cell types. So we have cells here that we refer to as either a blast or a site. A blast or a site. So we have bone matrix and we have bone cells. And this picture here is compact bone. It's ground. So it's a ground specimen. Did I explain the grounding technique when we talked about tissues, ground bone? I thought I did, but just to refresh. So in lab, when you look at a slide and it says ground bone, like what does that mean? It's referring to the preparation of the slide. So we take a sample, and with this particular prep, because it's hard tissue, you actually have to make a very thick slice using a very sharp blade, like a tungsten carbide blade. So you make a chunk of tissue, and you put the chunk of tissue on the slide, then you actually grind it or polish it down to a thinner section. The other way that you can do it is you can actually decalcify the preparation and put it in wax, like what we talked about in the tissue section. But the ground bone prep is telling you that this is actually native bone that wasn't decalcified. So it has all the calcium in it. So that's why it's important to know that it's a ground bone prep versus a decalcified bone prep. Okay? So what you can kind of appreciate, remember my pencil example with the lead down the middle? So these are columns that are coming out at you. Columns that are coming out at you. And it's referred to as this Haversian system, or these Haversian canals. And these cells live within this Haversian system. And all these little kind of black little, splashes, if you will, or almost like these black stars, are where cells are hanging out in their respective little lacunae. And they're very happy there. So we've got 4 different types of cells that we need to characterize. We've got osteogenic cells, and we find those in the endosteum as well as the periosteum. So we find them on the endo is the inside, and peri is like perimeter on the outside. So we find osteogenic cells in both locations. Those are the progenitor cells. Those are the embryonic fibroblasts is where they come from. And they're continuously dividing, making osteoblasts in these 2 layers of the inside of the bone as well as the surrounding tissue on the outside of the bone. Once it becomes an osteoblast, well, it no longer can divide. It's non-mitotic. That's what that means. So the osteogenic cells have to build and differentiate into an osteoblast. The osteoblast won't replicate and actually form another osteoblast. It has to come from this osteogenic cell, and it differentiates into an osteoblast. Osteoblasts are found in the endosteum and the periosteum, where these osteogenic cells live. They secrete copious amounts of collagen, a very structurally sound protein that we learned about in tissues. And they make this matrix that becomes encrusted in a bone mineral known as hydroxyapatite. And that's the matrix that these cells like to live in. Hydroxyapatite is made up of calcium and phosphate. And that's why calcium homeostasis is so important for bone, because that's the matrix that makes up the outside of the bone. There's a lot of collagen in skin, right? But if you feel the skin, there's no calcium phosphate. There's no hydroxyapatite. That's why it's not stiff. or hard. But the collagen that's found in the bone encrusts with a calcium phosphate known as hydroxyapatite, making it hard, right? Like you would expect. Now, this can further differentiate into what we refer to as an osteocyte. And an osteocyte is a cell that's mature. That's the bone cell, osteo, bone, cyte, cell. So this is a mature bone cell that differentiates from an osteoblast. And these osteocytes are what we see in this little like black little splash. That's this guy right here that's blown up in higher magnification right here. That's an osteocyte living in a lacunae. This is a scanning electron micrograph. This is 2 microns, this little scale bar. So, this is 10 microns, this scale bar. So this osteocyte is about 10 microns wide by about 20, 25 microns long. Gets trapped in the matrix, and it has connections to other nearby osteocytes via these channels known as cannuliculi. Cannuliculi, which in Latin translates to little channel, cannuliculi. The last of the 4 bone cell types that we need to talk about are the osteoclasts. So the osteoclasts, in my opinion, are kind of the neatest looking. They're kind of the coolest cell type of the bone cells. They're not the most important by any stretch of the imagination, but they're very, very interesting. The reason is these are actually multinucleated cells. So they are the fusion of a number of cells, a number of progenitor cells, stem cells, that form an osteoclast. Now remember, these are the cells that break down bone. The osteoblasts are the ones that build it. The osteoclasts break it down. Look at this edge right here. It looks like a comb. Or if you looked at it on end, it would look like a mohawk. Why do you think this leading edge? So here is a resorption bay. Here is an osteoclast. It's multinucleated. You see all these nuclei. Has these lysosomes that are releasing hydrochloric acid, actually, and acid phosphatase. The acid phosphatase digests the collagen. The hydrochloric acid digests minerals and a lot of the inorganic material. So it's literally spitting out from these lysosomes hydrochloric acid and enzymes to break down bone. You see how it went, from a straight piece of bone to this pit. It's got this, and it's called a resorption bay. And right here, leading the charge is this ruffled border, which is this mohawk-looking structure. Do you think that's important? Why does it have this ruffled border as it kind of charges forward? Any ideas? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it looks cool. You think in the back? To connect the two? Okay. I could see that, but there's actually no physical connection, but that's a good guess. Any other ideas? No? Here? More surface area. So if you're releasing hydrochloric acid and acid phosphatase, and you have this ruffled border, you're releasing, if you stretch this thing out, right? If you stretch the cell out, it would literally go from here to like up here. But it's all compacted here with this ruffled border, maximizing the surface area that can release the enzyme and the hydrochloric acid to more effectively digest away the bone. This is a perfect example of how structure dictates function, right? This cell on the back end doesn't make a ruffled border because it's actually digesting in that direction. I think that's so cool that the biology does that. It literally modifies its leading front surface for breaking down bone. Perfect example of kind of what we've been talking about since the beginning of the semester. So this acid phosphatase digests the collagen, the hydrochloric acid digests the minerals, Here's a picture. This is a preparation that's not ground bone. This is actually demineralized bone. So you take out the calcium in the prep and you put it in wax. So it's not a ground bone prep, so you get a slightly different picture. But this osteoclast, this one's moving from left to right. This one's moving from right to left. Do you see that? The resorption bay is on the left side. Here's where this bone, and here's the resorption bay pit, and then it goes like this. And you know this is an osteoclast. You can't really appreciate the ruffled border, but you can see the multinucleated cell in comparison to other cells that have one nucleus. And here's an osteo what? What is this? Osteocyte inside of a, what's it living in? A lacunae. Perfect. So this side we're digesting right to left. This picture is showing it digesting from left to right. Does that make sense? Okay. So where we're going to go with the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts in the future, in future lectures, why we have both. So if we take sunlight, it hits cholesterol in the skin, it makes vitamin D. Vitamin D has activity on the kidney and on the gut. On the kidney to prevent calcium from being excreted in the urine. You don't want to lose precious calcium. In the gut, you want to absorb as much of the calcium out of your food as possible. That calcium gets deposited by osteoblasts in a collagen hydroxyapatite or a calcium phosphate matrix that makes it hard, right? The osteoclast comes in and breaks it down and frees up calcium. So you store calcium with the osteoblast, you liberate calcium with the osteoclast. So is someone going to ask the question like, well, that seems like a colossal waste of energy. Why don't you just make bone once? Why do you just keep remodeling it? Any ideas? Why go through all this biological energy to make the bone and then break it down and then make it again and break it down? Any ideas? Accommodate for growth. Okay, that's one. You're all done growing in this room. Right? Most females, I'm guessing there's nobody 16 or under. And most males, you're probably over 18. Some of you might still be growing a little bit, but let's just pretend that all of us are done growing. I would love nothing more than to, still have a growth spurt, but I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. But that's part of the reason. Other ideas? What's that? Oh, compression? Yeah, okay. Compression. Let's come back to that. I agree. Repair damages, like when you have a fracture. Okay, love that. Let's go to the compression. So there's a law, it's called Wolff's Law, and we'll talk about it very specifically in the next lectures. But Julius Wolff was a German surgeon, and his theory was that bone actually remodels based upon the forces or the compressive forces that it's placed under. And then, and this is in the 1800s that he actually proposed this theory. And so we've been able to demonstrate this time and time again, and you'll see this clinically in your patients. So if you don't put load forces on bone, the bone resorbs. It favors osteoclastic activity, and you break down the bone. It's this concept, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you load the bone, well, the bone's going to remodel. It's a type of compression to Wolff's Law, but it's also a type of a healing response. We're saying, okay, there's more forces on this bone, so I'm going to remodel it to be more robust, more dense, thicker, stronger to support the load. That happens throughout our entire life. Now, you insert that with calcium homeostasis, the demands in our bloodstream for calcium levels fluctuate throughout the day. So the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts are remodeling your bone right now as you're sitting in these chairs. Then if you get up and you go work out at the gym, it's remodeling based upon those stresses. If you get and you go for a run, or you go up to the mountain, you do some skiing, it remodels based on those stresses. How many of you actually had a broken bone in a cast for 6 to 8 weeks? What happened to that appendage when you pulled it out of the cast? What did it look like? It was skinny. Yeah, you're like, ooh, that's pathetic. Well, a lot of that, what you're seeing is muscle atrophy, but the bone itself has remodeled. It healed, but it's not nearly as thick as your contralateral control. Let's say it's your left and your right arm. In fact, if you're left hand dominant or right hand dominant, you'll have different typically bone densities in your dominant arm versus your non-dominant arm. Fast forward to geriatric population, sedentary bed rest patients. Not much activity. What happens to the density of their bone? Is it dominated by osteoclasts or osteoblasts? Osteoclasts. So from a physical therapy standpoint, how many are going to be physical therapists if everything goes well? Okay, few. How many are going to be physicians or nurses? Okay, more. You're going to be treating patients probably from a broad spectrum. You don't know what you're specializing in yet, but you'll deal with elderly patients, and you're going to try to encourage them to stay physically active. This is why. Okay, we'll talk more about osteoporosis in subsequent lectures, but this is the building blocks for that, and that's Wolff's Law and osteoclastic and osteoblastic activity. Okay, now back on track. What is in the bone matrix? Well, it's made up of a third of organic material and 2/3 of inorganic material. So here's another example of, remember in the first unit we were talking about, organic's important, but it's not everything. We said, water is really important for life, but it's not an organic molecule. Well, here in bone, most of the bone is inorganic material, not organic, and it's critically important. So organic includes things like collagen, glycoproteins, proteoglycans, and the inorganic is the hydroxyapatite, the calcium phosphate. And that is what actually resists the compression, is the inorganic. And the organic resists the tension and the bending. And so together you have a strong and yet flexible structure. Bone actually has about 7% elastin in it. So that's why when you load it, it'll slightly give and flex. As you get older, the elastin composition in bone fades, becomes less and less. So now you put pressure on it and it's more likely to snap. That in combination with osteoporosis or lower bone density makes weaker bones. So picture over here some histology. You can see trabecular bone, the H&E. You can see the adipocytes, a lot of fat in the bone marrow, which is the regenerative layer. Then you can see lamellar bone matrix. You see these rings. You see those kind of rings that look like smiley faces kind of going from top to bottom. You can see an osteocyte there in the lacunae, and then you can see some calcified cartilage that's being pointed out. Remember, as bones are made, the cartilage forms the template, and then it ossifies. As the chondrocytes leave, the osteocytes come in. Okay, so the parts of osseous tissue. The lamellae, the Haversian canal, the osteon, and the perforating canal. So you're going to go through this pretty extensively in lab, but for sake of completeness, I want to talk about this. So if you look down the middle, these are these sort of pencil cylinders that we talked about earlier. We've got our central canal that is in the middle of the osteon, and this is the Haversian system. Havers was the name of the individual that just first described this. So we're starting to move away from people's names, but some of them are still sticking. Like Volkmann was the name of the individual that discovered these perforating canals. And these perforating canals are the ones that actually go from side to side. And the Haversian system, or the osteon, houses the central canal down the middle, and then these concentric rings that are these lamellae as you sort of move out, and they're connected to other lamellae by these cannuliculi, or these small little channels to actually perfuse the entire bone architecture. So the osteon is kind of referred to as like the functional unit of bone. the functional architectural organization of bone is the osteon. All right, so let's talk about the parts of spongy bone, otherwise known as cancellous, otherwise known as trabeculated bone. We talked about this in tissues, but just to refresh, you can see the spicules of bone, or the trabeculae, and then you can see these islands of marrow, which are mostly adipose tissue. And these trabeculae develop along lines of stress, like Wolff's Law. So as you use your bone, your trabeculae are going to organize. It's almost like a bridge design, where your bridge is actually modifying its architectural struts underneath the roadway based upon traffic patterns on a daily basis, right? That's how specific your bone remodels, is based upon the lines of stress. You'll get the trabeculae organized in certain fashions. Now, instead of having a solid mass of bone that's very heavy, takes a lot of energy to make, you create these open spaces and you fill it with fat. You fill it with fat that's regenerative tissue. It's a bone marrow that actually gives rise to our red blood cells and our white blood cells. And so we take advantage of the osseous tissue and advantage of the design by leveraging these open spaces. So in the bone marrow, we've got soft tissue that's between the trabeculae and in the marrow cavities, or the medullary cavities. And this soft tissue that's mostly adipose tissue is referred to as hematopoietic tissue. Hematopoietic means blood-forming tissue. And if it's blood-forming and it's active, it's considered red bone marrow. So red bone marrow is extremely hematopoietic. It's highly active. It's active in all of us, you to a greater extent than me because of our age difference. In children, all of the medullary cavities and all of the spaces in pediatric cases are occupied by red bone marrow. In adults, it starts to switch. In adults, it only is occupied in the pectoral and pelvic girdles, the proximal heads of the femur and the humerus. That's the upper leg, the femur, and then the humerus is the upper arm. Because you don't need as much activity as you did when you were an infant. Now, as time moves on, we've got yellow bone marrow, which replaces the red bone marrow. This is made up of mostly adipocytes that are not regenerative any longer, but it can revert back to hematopoietic red bone marrow in an emergency situation, like in the case of a disease or an infection or stress in the individual. So it's still, it's like it's on call. It's a reserve. It's like the Army Reserves. So yellow bone marrow, as you age, was old red bone marrow that's somewhat dormant, but it can actually be recalled and become hematopoietic again. Now, gelatinous bone marrow is what you find in old age. One of the reasons that our elderly population wrestles with more sickness and illness. They also wrestle with, oxygenation issues or shortness of breath. They may have to, carry oxygen with them, have trouble living at high altitudes, because this bone marrow now becomes dysfunctional or dormant, not able to revert back to red bone marrow, no longer hematopoietic, it's over. We refer to it as a gelatinous bone marrow. Now, interestingly enough, there's a couple of other cases, not just in geriatric patients, but patients that wrestle with anorexia, malabsorption, HIV, and AIDS also have been identified to carry or present with large amounts of gelatinous bone marrow. Okay, an application. I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I want you to discuss this situation of a patient whose bone marrow has been compromised from disease. And to kind of get the conversation started, I'm asking this question: why is the bone marrow so important functionally? All right, I'd love to hear some thoughts, some ideas. Let's start with the last question. Why is it so important? What does it do for us? Manufactures blood cells. Yep, blood cells, that's right. Specifically, what kind of blood cells? Red blood cells and white blood cells. What do red blood cells do for us physiologically? Carry oxygen. What do white blood cells do for us physiologically? Fight disease. They're part of our immune system. Okay? So you have a patient that's compromised from a disease state. Let's say they have a leukemia. The root word there, leukocyte is a white blood cell. The leukemia patient usually has very low, if not absent, white blood cell counts. That's a cancer of the bone marrow. So why is that a problem in that patient? Do you see the connection here? I mean, you're very dangerous to them. They're not dangerous to you. You can't catch cancer. It's your own cells that mutate, right? It's not an infectious disease. What's that? You can give them a lot of infection, yeah. And that's why if you have a friend or a family member that's ever been wrestling with cancer, you'll mask up. They'll be very cautious about you being in near them, not because they're worried about you getting cancer, just to dispel any myths. It's because they're worried about you getting them sick. And if they have no immune system, they might get pneumonia from a common bug that, you'd have a little chest cold for a few days and take some Dayquil and NyQuil and you'd be fine. So bone marrow transplants, what are those? Yeah. Perfect. I'll just repeat it for the video because you're not mic'd. It's a transplant from a healthy patient to someone that wrestled with usually a bone marrow cancer. The cancer is now in remission, or they've treated it. Usually the treatment with cancer is you try to kill the cancer. As you kill the cancer in the bone marrow, you tend to kill all the cells that are there. So you actually do a transplant to repopulate healthy bone marrow from somebody else that's a donor. You have to have a really careful match in order for that to happen. Okay, but this is a pretty amazing feat of medicine that's been around for decades. It's actually not a new procedure. It's pretty amazing that this is something that we can do. I think it's a pretty cool topic with respect to the clinical relevance that we're talking about. Okay, for the remaining 20 minutes, we're going to spend about 10 on intramembranous ossification and 10 on endochondral ossification. These are two types of ways that bones form and develop. We have two physiologic mechanisms by which bone is made. Okay? Ossification is a term that means hardening of the bone. And the first type is intramembranous. Intramembranous. What do you think that word means? Intramembrane. inside a membrane or between two membranes is literally how that translates. Intrastate commerce. Like, what? What's intrastate commerce? That's business that's happening within the state of Arizona. Interstate commerce, that's between states, right? So intra-membrane is between two membranes. And then the other one's endochondral ossification. And we'll talk about that last. So the first one, intramembranous. This happens at about 8 weeks of development in utero. And this is how the flat bones form. Just flat bones. So flat bones have their own mechanism, and then everybody else has a different mechanism. So flat bones only, 8 weeks. You've got 2 sheets of mesenchymal cells, 2 membranes of mesenchyme. Do you see these 2 membranes here? Do you see what's happening between the membranes? Intramembranous ossification. This is where the hardening is happening in between the membranes. So, number one is you have these ossification centers where you get these mesenchymal cells that differentiate into osteoblasts. You start bringing in a vascular supply. You see this blood vessel, this blood capillary. Over here, you start organizing in between the membrane. The outer membranes stay where they are. This inner membrane, you've got osteoblastic activity laying down bone mineral. You've got this organization here that's happening of these trabeculae. If you fast forward over here, you can see now the trabeculae are organized along lines of stress. They started here, now they're organizing on lines of stress. The vasculature enlarges and expands to perfuse this, keep everybody healthy. In between the trabeculae, we create these marrow spaces. You can see in the actual bone itself, we've got osteocytes in their lacunae taking residence, still between these 2 membranes. These outer membranes harden and form compact bone, and the spongy bone in the middle remains. And here we have our diploid setup of a flat bone, 2-sided. All of this language is what I just walked through. Okay? Let's do it one more time. What do you think? Okay. So we start with an ossification center. We have mesenchymal layer on the top, mesenchymal layer on the bottom. Those are our intermembranes. Those are our 2 membranes. Most everything's happening in the middle. The only thing that happens here is everything condenses. When these guys condense, they form compact bone. When the inner portion condenses, it still maintains this architecture with marrow cavity and trabeculae, so you get a spongy bone on the other side. Okay, same pictures, but different text up here. As the osteoblasts are making bone mineral, they secrete that matrix. The calcium phosphate, right, that's the hydroxyapatite. That's the bone mineral that actually is being spit out by the osteoblast. And this trabeculae becomes this spongy bone. This trabeculae becomes this spongy bone. And ultimately, the osteoblasts that are in the bone differentiate into an osteocyte, a mature bone cell, and they live within these little lacunae. And there's lacunae up here that aren't being shown, but there's lacunae down here as well that are kind of being appreciated right in this picture. Eight weeks of embryonic development, flat bones only, between 2 membranes. These outer layers calcify, forming the flat bone top and the flat bone bottom, and in between is that trabeculated spongy bone. Does that make sense? Pretty straightforward, right? So the skull, flat bones in the skull. Now, these flat bones in the skull have sutures, and so they don't completely fuse right away. There's a fibrous connective tissue between these different flat bones of the skull, and those little soft areas of connective tissue are referred to as fontanelles. Why do we have those? What's the purpose of that? So during delivery, that's exactly right. During delivery, the head is the largest part of the organism, and it can essentially squish a little bit and flex as it comes through the vaginal canal. Second reason is it allows for a little bit of growth of the skull after birth. Now, the anterior fontanelle closes at about 18 to 24 months. That's the frontal. That's this one. The sphenoid, or the anterior lateral, 3 months. The mastoidal, or the posterior lateral, at about a year. And then the occipital, the posterior aspect, at about 2 to 4 months. So it allows for some additional growth of the head post-delivery. So you can appreciate in this skull, and you can see in lab, when you look at the skull, the different suture lines. All right, the last topic for today, and then you want to stay to the very end because we've got an activity. Endochondral ossification. Now, instead of 8 weeks, this is 6 weeks. And instead of flat bones, this is everything else. So you just have two processes to understand, one for flat, intramembranous, and one for everything else. Flat bones take a little longer. Everything else is a little faster, by about 2 weeks. In this particular model, you've got a cartilage model, hyaline cartilage, that serves as a template for the development of, in this example, is a long bone. So what we're going to see is we're going to see a cartilage template. We form a primary ossification center in the middle. These are cartilage cells, or chondrocytes. They're actually going to hollow out the inside of this bone, making a medullary space. And the stimulus for that is the invasion of the blood supply. Believe it or not, the chondrocytes are used to not having a lot of blood. So the moment that a blood supply comes in, they sort of migrate to the proximal and the distal ends. That blood supply hollows out the inside and stimulates the ossification of the diaphysis, or the shaft, leaving secondary ossification centers on the proximal and distal ends that do the exact same thing. They get invaded by a blood vessel. The chondrocytes get replaced by bone, except for at the epiphyseal line. That remains hyaline cartilage for future growth. That's the growth plate that we talked about in the very beginning of the lecture. And then at some point in the future, the epiphyseal line, 16 for females, 18 for males, approximately, plus or minus a couple years, this ossifies and future vertical growth is done. Bone remodeling still plays a role, like appositional growth, like thinner or thicker or more dense or less dense, but the length is done by the time you're 20 years of age. Does that make sense? Let's do it one more time, okay? So we start out in utero, 6 weeks, all bones in the body except for which ones? Flat bones, thank you. We're given an example of a long bone because it's the easiest example and it ties into some of the earlier parts in the lecture. We start with a template, which is hyaline cartilage. Do you see why we have to teach about tissues and what the different types of cartilage is? So now that we're using the cartilage to actually make bones. The hyaline cartilage, the primary ossification center in the middle, are chondrocytes. Those are cartilage cells. Cartilage cells This is the same pictures, just a little bit of text that I just explained, and I'm going to walk you through it, okay? So there's really nothing new here. We already talked about it. I'm doing it a second time, and then I'll walk you through step by step a couple of the pictures at a time. But that hyaline cartilage primary ossification center gets invaded through that nutrient foramina. The vessels are the trigger where it starts to form this perichondrium and a periosteum. So you form this medullary space and you push the chondrocytes to the proximal and the distal ends. You vascularize the center, hollow it out for marrow, and you stimulate osteoblasts to move in instead of chondrocytes. This is the primary marrow cavity and the primary ossification center. It ultimately forms this bony collar that you start to enlarge. As you enlarge, right, the chondrocytes swell. That's hypertrophy. That cuts off the circulation to the chondrocytes. So they actually go through an apoptotic cycle or a programmed cell death, making way for the osteoblasts to replace them. So then we get this periosteal bud, right? The periosteal bud happens on these secondary centers. The cavity gets invaded by all the other cells that we need, ultimately resulting in ossification, where you start depositing matrix over this calcified cartilage. So we're depositing osteoblasts are making hydroxyapatite, or the bone mineral, the calcium phosphate, the collagen, hardening the inside of that primary ossification center. And then it spreads towards the epiphyseal ends. As it spreads towards these epiphyseal ends, you've got this medullary space in the middle here. You create a second medullary space, second marrow cavity on the proximal and the distal. So it's not secondary, tertiary, it's two secondaries. Does that make sense? Because these happen at the same time. The secondary sites on the proximal and the distal end happen at the same time. Same mechanism. The stimulus is the invasion of the blood flow, and the process develops similarly that it did in the shaft and the epiphyseal ends. Ultimately, we leave in childhood a little bit of a hyaline cartilage model that we're going to talk about in the next lecture. You're going to focus on this right here for a little while. And this allows for future growth, vertical growth in the long bones, eventually hardening later in teenage years, leading to an epiphyseal line. The plate is the growth plate. The line you can actually see on X-ray. You can see an epiphyseal line on X-ray. Questions? Two ways bone forms. Flat bones formed by what mechanism? Intramembranous ossification. About what week of development? 8 weeks. All other bones formed by what mechanism? Endochondral ossification. About what week of embryonic development? 6. I think you got it.